Mary Baker Eddy, the discoverer of Christian Science, knew human life very well. She grew up in the 1820s and 1830s in the region of the United States called New England, where the city of Boston is, for example. Specifically, she was the sixth in a family of 6 children on a family farm in the state of New Hampshire. As a little girl, she loved God deeply, and she delighted in her family. Because she was often sick, she couldn't attend school regularly, but she was intensely interested in learning. She was intensely interested in the world around her. She was strongly encouraged in her studies, especially by her brother Albert. She was strongly encouraged, especially by her mother, to put into practice the teachings of Jesus. At age 22, Mary Baker married George Glover, a builder. And together, they moved to a very different part of the United States, to North Carolina. There, after 6 months, and in spite of their earnest prayers, he died suddenly of yellow fever. Yes, a contagious disease, leaving her alone and expecting. She returned to New Hampshire, where she lived initially with her parents and later with a sister. When her son was born, she named him George after the father. He was a handful. He was a wild, energetic little boy. And because she was often sick, it was challenging for her to care for him. Somewhat later, the rest of her family, concerned about her health and against her wishes, had the child taken away and placed in the care of another family. Of course, that broke her heart. And I think that it was one of the reasons why she wanted to marry again, to form a family circle to receive back her little son. She married Daniel Patterson, an itinerant dentist, but their marriage was not a happy one. His income was never regular enough that they could enjoy much financial stability. And towards the end of the marriage, he was no longer faithful. Although she worked at saving that marriage during more than 20 years, finally, she divorced him. And the family with whom her son was living moved to what was then considered to be the far west, to Minnesota. And he was told that his mother had passed on. She heard nothing from him for more than 5 years and didn't see him again for close to 25 years. Of course, we all have challenges. How was Mary Baker facing hers? By striving even more to put into practice the teachings of Jesus, by turning even more fully to the Bible. She knew that the Bible is filled with the promise that God is always present to help us in moments of difficulty. But how to prove that practically in the midst of loneliness, in the midst of poverty, in the midst of ill health? During this time, she explored various methods of improving her health: conventional medicine, um, a system of healing that was very popular at that time called the water cure, homeopathy, and even what we today would call hypnotism. For a time, she used the services of a well-known mental healer, Phineas Quimby, and she seemed to be better, but only for a time. And finally, she was disappointed because the basis of his system of healing wasn't the spiritual and moral principle that was the basis of the teachings and the basis of the healings of Jesus. In 1866, she had a breakthrough. She was walking to a temperance meeting. That was a kind of meeting that was quite common at that time, organized to try to discourage the consumption of alcohol in society in general. It was in winter, in February, in Lynn, Massachusetts, not far from Boston. And walking to this meeting, she fell on a slippery sidewalk, and because of the fall, became unconscious. She was taken to a house that wasn't far from there, and the physician who attended her diagnosed serious internal injuries and didn't think that she would survive. But she came to and asked for a Bible. Then, in a moment of great inspiration, while she was reading one of the accounts of Jesus' healings in the Gospels, her decades of searching for spiritual answers, her decades of searching for better health, culminated in a healing. She was suddenly well, to the surprise of her friends. And although she experienced minor relapses over the next few months, she was finally entirely healed, not only of the effects of the fall, but ever after that experience, she enjoyed better health than before. What had she seen? Later, she would write that during those moments of great inspiration, she saw that beyond anything physical, beyond anything biological or organic, was the reality of God as infinite life. And she was at one with this life. And in this relationship of oneness, she had everything that she would ever need, including her health. Throughout history, many people have been healed and then they've simply gone on with their lives. But she wanted to understand, how had she been healed? Why was she healed when she was healed? Why not earlier or later? And could the good results be repeated in other cases with other people? Very naturally for her, she turned even more to her Bible. And she was taking very detailed notes on what she was studying in the Bible. She was finding that with this understanding of God as infinite life, with this understanding of individuality as being the expression of this infinite life, she could consistently heal other people. And not long after that, she began to teach others how to heal with this understanding. The fact that not just she, but others as well could heal with this understanding confirmed for her that the power to heal wasn't a personal power that she had from God, but that she had come to discover the science of healing that was the basis of the healing works of Jesus. These healings were significant physical healings: diphtheria, malaria, tuberculosis. But there was also an important moral dimension. Often the person healed felt spiritually uplifted. Often the person became a better person, less selfish, for example. By 1875, she had organized her many notes on the Bible into a book. This is the book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. In it, she explains how to experience protection even during a contagious disease, even if one is directly exposed to that contagious disease in the course of one's duties, for example. She also explains how to be healed of a contagious disease through prayer alone. But before talking more specifically about that, I wanted to read two passages that are perhaps even more fundamental. First, this passage from page 259 of the book. The Christ-like understanding of scientific being and divine healing includes a perfect principle and idea, perfect God and perfect man, as the basis of thought and demonstration. Well, she wasn't meaning by that humans are perfect. No, she was saying that beyond anything human is the reality of God and his perfection. And each of us in our true spiritual being manifests that divine perfection. Here's another passage from page 547 of the book. You can prove for yourself, dear reader, the science of healing, and so ascertain if the author has given you the correct interpretation of Scripture. Someone who did just that was Asa Gilbert Eddy. And in 1877, they married. And so Mary Baker became Mary Baker Eddy. Speaking of demonstrating this science for oneself, I wanted to recount two personal experiences, one in the context of COVID-19, but first, an experience that I had about 15 years ago. I began to experience very sharp pains in my lower abdomen. In reality, these were painful episodes that lasted 2 or 3 hours. I prayed with some of these very ideas that God is infinite, perfect life, and that I'm perfect now as the very expression of this life. During this time, I was working for the Church of Christ Scientist. And a little bit later on in the talk, I'll tell you a bit about the church. And in the role in which I was fulfilling, I needed to appear to speak in public 6 times a week. But happily, these painful episodes never interfered with that work. They came on other days at other times. I was so grateful for that. Also, during a part of this time, I received the visit of various family members. And had these family members been aware that I was experiencing these pains, they would have been very concerned. But they never learned. If I was with them and needed to pray because of these painful episodes, I was able to simply say that I had work to do, which was not surprising. I almost always had work to do at that time. And I was so grateful that I could just go to another part of the house and pray, and that my family members were never concerned. As a matter of fact, these pains made me think of the experience of a family member decades before, when the person had been hospitalized and diagnosed with gallstones. Also, during a part of this period, I received help from first one and later from another Christian Science practitioner. A Christian Science practitioner is a person who gives his or her full time to helping others through prayer. Together, we looked at passages from the Bible, from Science and Health. We prayed together. I was so grateful for their help. The painful episodes stopped after about 2 or 3 weeks. They stopped until they came back again about 5 months later. But this time I was very much ready to meet them to meet those sensations and those fears with a great sense of authority, with a great sense of conviction that I am perfect now and always free to be serving God, free to do what seemed most right in terms of service to this one infinite God. The pain stopped entirely. And as I said, that experience, I had that experience about 15 years ago. Such a healing has as its basis a higher concept of individuality. The basis of my prayers was that I'm spiritual as the very reflection of God. Such a healing has as its basis a higher concept of God. Who is God? Christian Science teaches that he or she, instead of being one thing amongst many things in the universe, instead of being one entity amongst many entities in the universe, that in reality, God is infinite. God is all. But how can that be? How can God be all if we live in a world made up of things? Mary Baker Eddy found in the scriptures a sense of God as being infinite, unopposed love, the only life, the only intelligence, the only mind, the only substance of the universe, and that this was the basis of the teachings and healing works of Jesus. Of course, we can read in the Bible in 1 John that God is love. Also, we can read in the Gospel of Luke what has sometimes been called the pearl of parables, the parable of the prodigal son. In this parable recounted by Jesus, a father whose heart is just filled with compassion and love accepts back his youngest son, who has treated him most disrespectfully and who has simply gone off and wasted his inheritance. When the son realizes he has nothing left, not even anything to eat, he decides to go back to the Father, but he doesn't think that the Father will take him back as a son, maybe as a servant, and at least in that way he'll have something to eat. But when he's coming back, the Father sees him from a long ways off, and the Father runs to meet him and embraces him and kisses him. And the Father says that he wants to celebrate because he says, this, my son, was lost and is found. He was dead and is alive again. With that parable, Jesus was indicating the nature of God as infinite, you could even say unconditional love for each and every one of us. What Mary Baker Eddy was seeing was truly revolutionary and was challenging the most basic assumptions of human thought itself. She wasn't seeing that there are difficulties and discords and diseases, including contagious diseases, and then there's also infinite love. She was seeing that infinite love is so infinite that it actually exists instead of an imperfect material creation. In other words, there isn't a basic human context in which suffering is normal, natural, and inevitable for every one of us. And then there's also infinite love. She was seeing that infinite love is so infinite that it actually excludes the existence of anything other than this love and its expression. I think it's easy to see that with this concept of God as being infinite love, the only substance filling all space, we may need to rethink who we are. The conventional way of thinking is that we're physical beings, or essentially physical beings, who are evolving physically in a physical universe that itself is evolving physically. But the first thing that we can say right off the bat is that in truth, each of us simply shines eternally as the very expression of this infinite unopposed love. And that identity then is not subject to being oppressed. Identity then is not subject to being diminished. Identity is not subject to being isolated. Identity is not subject to being contaminated. Here's an analogy to help you see more clearly what I mean. Think of a building with 3 stories. So the ground floor, the first story, and the second story. Each story is going to correspond to a concept of identity. The ground floor could correspond to a sense of identity as being exclusively physical. So the person is born shaped by the genes of his or her parents, shaped by the person's first experiences and later by other experiences. So the person is made up of chemicals and atoms. The person lives a certain number of years. Hopefully the person loves at least a little bit, and then the person is no more. That's one concept of identity. The first story could correspond to a sense of identity as being essentially physical. So the person is living physically, but in addition, the person has a soul inside. So the body lives a certain number of years and then the body is no more, but the soul survives. Although, unfortunately, nobody knows exactly in what form. That's a second concept of identity, but I want to talk to you about the second story, a completely different sense of identity. According to this sense of identity, each of us coexists eternally with this infinite unopposed love as the very expressions of this love. And what gives us our identity, what makes us unique, isn't how old we are or how tall we are or the color of our skin. What makes us who we are is each of us is a unique expression of the qualities of this infinite love, qualities like joy, intelligence, wisdom, strength, and so on. It's from this second story sense of ourselves from which all good flows. It's because we're strong and loving as expressions of this infinite love. That's why we can show forth that love and strength even better by being better parents, by being better grandparents. It's because we're intelligent as the expressions of this infinite love. That's why we can show forth that intelligence by doing our jobs better. It's because wholeness and wellness is built right into who we are as the very expressions of this infinite love. That's why we can show forth that wholeness and that wellness by being healthier. If we're purely spiritual, how do you explain those other two concepts, the ground floor and the first story? The first thing that we can say is that, seen from an absolute point of view, they're simply human beliefs, they're simply human concepts that have no absolute reality. They're simply what people think. And these human concepts, these human beliefs, are neither created by this infinite divine love, nor are they even known to this infinite love. And in fact, these concepts have no actual substance. That said, the material sense of things, our highest collective perception of God's creation, can't help but reflect in some measure the beauty of spiritual life. So all of the beautiful things about human existence, and I mentioned just a few of those beautiful things at the start of the talk, are to be cherished, appreciated, loved, celebrated, not because they represent the absolute spiritual reality that Mary Baker Eddy found in the scriptures, but because even as a human perception of things, they have great value. And as we grow spiritually, all of the beautiful things about human existence become more beautiful as we see them in a more spiritual way, while all of the bad things about human existence simply fade away because we come to see that they have no actual substance. There's not actually anything holding them in place. They're not grounded on any principle. They're not grounded on this infinite rock of the allness of love. We, on the other hand, are indeed rooted and grounded in this infinite love. And that's why we exist in complete security. That's why our perfection as children of God is always intact. That's why we can show forth that perfection by overcoming sin, for example, overcoming unloving thoughts, stopping unloving actions. And in Christian Science, it's very important to overcome sin. But we overcome sin not as a part of identity, because identity is the reflection of this perfect love, but as a lie about identity. In truth, identity is the very image and likeness of this unopposed love. So it's just as sinless as this perfect love is sinless. When a dog comes out of a lake or river, the dog shakes himself off to be free of the water. But the water is no part of the dog. In the same way, we can shake sin off as being no part of us. There's a passage in the Bible that says essentially this. It's in the Bible book of Ephesians, and I'm going to be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. This is what it says. You were taught to put away your former way of life, your old self, corrupt and deluded by its lusts, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to clothe yourselves with the new self, created according to the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. The person who best showed forth his true righteousness and holiness was Christ Jesus. When you read the Gospels, it seems as if Jesus is always feeling his oneness with God. It seems as if Jesus is always seeking to know and to do the will of God. I think that it was for that reason that Jesus was unafraid to reach out and touch the man who was filled with leprosy and to bring him healing, even as he brought healing to so many others. And not only did Jesus heal people, he also reformed them. He did this by seeing the individual in the light of this infinite love, by seeing the individuality's true identity as being the very expression of this infinite love. Jesus showed forth perfectly the Christ, and the Christ is the true idea of God as infinite, unopposed love. But the Christ existed before Jesus. Jesus exemplified the Christ, but the Christ is with each one of us right here, right now, and always. It's the Christ that encourages us if we're feeling depressed. It's the Christ that really awakens us to our true spiritual nature. It's the Christ that heals us. That was the experience of a friend of mine. The year was 1984, and she was in the hospital. She had just undergone an operation, and the doctors had discovered several tumors in her lower abdomen. The doctors hardly knew what to recommend in terms of treatment. They thought perhaps an exploratory operation and then maybe chemotherapy, but they didn't hold out much hope that she would be living much longer. So she was in the hospital, but she wasn't receiving any medical treatment. What she was doing was she was studying the Bible, she was studying science and health, and she was also receiving Christian Science treatment from a Christian Science practitioner. Together, the two of them were striving to see that health that she would always have as the very daughter of God, that health that could never be undermined, never could be taken away from her. Her husband, the very dearest of men, practically begged her to have the operation. So she decided to go forward with it. But this time, the doctors didn't find one single tumor. In fact, their words to her after the operation were, "You're clean as a baby." This healing happened in 1984. My friend is very active in her church. She has a very active family life and a wonderful circle of friends. You can hardly imagine her gratitude. Thinking this way, perfect God, each one of us perfect as God's own reflection, sometimes requires a certain inner discipline. Perhaps you have a neighbor who gets mad at you and you have no idea why. It requires perhaps a certain inner discipline to not simply react, but to turn to God in prayer, to see the neighbor in the light of God's own perfection, and to see if there's some step that might be taken to reconcile with the neighbor. Or perhaps you have a family member who, for the last few decades, has had a behavior that's been so problematical for that person and for the rest of the family. It requires, I think, a certain inner discipline to continue to love that person and to support that person as they reform and as they stop that problematical behavior. So I'm telling you very honestly, thinking this way sometimes requires a lot of discipline, a lot of work, but I can also tell you that it's also definitely worth it, because time and time again, I've seen this way of thinking bring healing to families and to communities. I think that thinking this way in the midst of a pandemic can also require a certain inner discipline. And you might even ask yourself if it's responsible to think like this in the midst of a pandemic. The answer to that question is yes. It's that Christian Science teaches that we don't worship God in isolation, but that we're to reach out and put our arms around the whole world in prayer and be uplifted with the whole world. Christian Science teaches a warm appreciation of everything good humanly. That certainly includes an appreciation of the nurse who spends long hours at the hospital caring for others. That certainly includes an appreciation of fellow citizens who respect what public health authorities might be asking to maintain a distance of 2 meters, for example. That certainly includes an appreciation of the politician who's able to communicate necessary information in a way that actually encourages and strengthens people. In my own experience, I found that thinking this way definitely affords a certain protection. I think I've traveled to some 33 or 34 countries around the world, often to countries where the level of public health is not that high, the level of public sanitation. I can remember being in Brazil some 6 or 7 times, Brazil, where dengue fever is almost always a problem. I can remember having been in Beira in Mozambique some years ago when the city was being very challenged with malaria. But when I've traveled to such places, it hasn't been with my eyes closed. It's been with my eyes open to see the protecting power of divine love, the power of God there to protect me, to protect everybody. I've traveled to those places with my heart open and filled with love. And what I've experienced, at least in some degree, is that as one's heart is filled with love, as one's thought is just simply filled to overflowing with love and goodwill, there actually is no room left over for fear or for the image of a virus. And one becomes, you might even say, a law unto oneself of healing, a law of protection. And wherever one turns one's thought, one brings and contributes to there being healing. I remember last year at about this time, I had just finished lecturing in Nigeria. I was on a 3-country lecture tour in Africa, and my throat had become quite sore. I asked a friend who is a Christian Scientist, to pray for me. That was a Sunday. And then very late that night, I received an instant message from a family member in Canada saying that the Canadian government was asking that all Canadians return home immediately while there were still commercial airlines in operation. I prayed about it through the night and decided early Monday morning to do my best to come back to Canada as quickly as possible. My throat was still sore, so I asked my friend to continue to pray for me. Perhaps a little bit like the situation for people in the Woking area, in the London area, or in other parts of the world, for me at that time, my material circumstances were very uncertain. Would I be able to get flights that would take me from Lagos, Nigeria to Ottawa, Canada? Would I be well enough to travel, or would I have to spend weeks or months in a hotel room far from home? I wanted to travel, I wanted to be well, but even more importantly, I wanted to obey the golden rule. That's where Jesus says that you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And in the context of a contagious disease, if a Christian Scientist is sick with a contagious disease, and if it's necessary to communicate that information in order to protect others, doing that, communicating that information is definitely the ethical thing to do. It's simply the practical ethics of the New Testament. So if that were necessary, I certainly would have done that. I prayed. I prayed essentially with 2 ideas. First, that everything I get directly and exclusively from the one source, from God. Even as each and every ray of the light, each and every ray of the sun gets all that it has directly and exclusively from the sun, not from the other rays. And of course, all that I could ever get from God is good, even as in truth, all that everybody can ever truly get from God is good. I also prayed with the idea that my home wasn't a geographical location, wasn't a familiar set of material objects or circumstances. My home was the consciousness of the omnipresence of this infinite love. And I knew that I had that consciousness. I began to call the airlines, but in March of last year, getting through to the airlines was almost impossible. So I started looking online. After prayer and work, I found an itinerary that would actually have me leaving the next day. I was going to be in 5 cities in 4 countries. It would be actually 2 consecutive days of travel, but it seemed realistic. So I purchased the ticket, and I spent the rest of that day, the rest of that Monday, praying for myself and praying for the world. I woke up Tuesday morning feeling perfectly fine. I thanked my friend for his prayers. I left the hotel at about 9 o'clock. I meticulously obeyed all of the requirements of the spirit and the letter of all of the requirements of all of the airlines and in all of the airports, including going through the thermal scanner in Accra, Ghana. And I returned home safe, and I returned home very late Wednesday night, safe and very happy. And of course, I self-isolated for 2 weeks, which was what the Canadian government was asking people coming from abroad to do. I wanted to recount that experience so that you would have confidence as we go further and further into 2021, that you would have confidence that wherever this pandemic finds you, you can maintain this idea of God's perfection and in truth, the perfection of everyone, and that this will guide you. This will bring you healing if that's the need that you have, if that's the need that your family has. This will contribute to bringing healing around the world. This will also guide you to take actions that are ethical and considerate towards others. And as you do that, of course, you'll experience this divine protection and help others experience that as well. Sometimes thinking this way, perfect God and each of us perfect, can almost change the nature of the person, the human character of the person. That was the experience of a friend of mine who learned of Christian Science when he was a teenager. He came from a low-income family, and he really didn't know his father. His father was not really present in his life. And one of his favorite activities was going out and drinking with his buddies. But he had a neighbor who was a member of the Christian Science Church. He liked this neighbor. The neighbor was quiet. He was a person of integrity. He obviously had a lot of confidence in God. Then this neighbor invited him to go with him to his church. And in Christian Science churches around the world, there's Sunday school for young people up to age 20. So in effect, it was an invitation to go to Sunday school. My friend thought about it and accepted the invitation. And what he heard that day in that Sunday school had a great impact on him, because he heard for the very first time that he has a perfect Father, Mother, God, Father, Mother, infinite love, and that he's perfect as an expression, as a son of this perfect Father, Mother love. He just loved that idea. He loved that idea so much that he decided to go back to that Sunday school, and he started attending that Sunday school regularly. And you know what it's like to have a house plant that hasn't received water for 7 days or 10 days, and then it gets water again, it just kind of springs to life. Well, that's really what was happening to him. The ideas that he was learning of in this Christian Science Sunday school were giving him a whole new perspective on himself and on the world. And they caused him to really want to consider the way he was living. There were a number of changes. One of them was he really liked his friends, but he decided he didn't want to drink anymore. So he stopped drinking. And then a way opened up for him to be able to go to university. This was surprising because, as I said, he came from a low-income family. And this was in the United States, where university usually costs a lot of money. he was accepted in the program. He was thrilled. And during his academic career, he studied very hard. But I think he, in a sense, he worked even harder on himself. He wanted to express so much love towards the other students, towards the professors, towards everybody. Fast forwarding now some 10 years or so, my friend graduated. He has a job he loves. He's very active in his community. He and his wife have a little boy. I think what impresses me most in this case is, no, not that he went to university and graduated, has a job he loves, but that this idea of the infinitude of divine love, one father-mother love, has enriched his life so much. And now he, through the way he's living, is enriching the lives of others. His life simply has a spiritual and moral orientation that it just simply never had before. I can hardly think of my friend without thinking of the Ten Commandments. We probably have all seen pictures of images of Moses with the Ten Commandments, a tablet in each arm. You can read about the Ten Commandments and about Moses in the Bible book of Exodus. The Ten Commandments were very important in the ministry of Jesus. Jesus references them often. The Ten Commandments were very important, have been very important in the evolution of humanity. If you think of the first commandment, to have no gods other than me, I love to think of that as meaning to simply recognize the infinitude of this love and to live one's life in harmony with this love. The second commandment, to have no graven images. Often we might think of a graven image as being a sculpture, a statue that a person might bow down to. But sometimes graven images can be purely mental. Even a disease, even a pandemic can be a kind of a graven image in a sense that we need not worship and fear. Or during this time of a pandemic, many of us are having to learn new technologies. An image of ourselves as being not very good with technology, that's a kind of a false image that we don't have to bow down to. The next the next commandment rather, to not take the name of God in vain. That certainly means to not swear, to speak politely, but I love to think of it as meaning to not take the nature of God as infinite love in vain, but to truly recognize this allness of love. The next commandment, to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. I love to go to church on Sunday, but I also love to recognize my own holiness and the holiness of everybody around me every day of the week. The next commandment is to honor thy father and thy mother. It just makes good sense to honor everything good in our human parents, even as we honor everything good in everybody around us. The next commandment, to not kill, obviously important, literally, but sometimes people can be a kind of killjoy, you might say, by maybe entertaining a limited sense of the capacities of another person. The next commandment, to not commit adultery, that certainly means to be faithful within one's marriage. It means to always have clean, pure thoughts. I also love to think of it as meaning to be a person who's very dependable. If you say you're going to do something, for example, you follow through, you go ahead and do it. The next commandment, to not steal, obviously that's important as well, literally. And, to the degree that we recognize that we have all good from God, we have no desire to steal. The next commandment, to not bear false witness, and that means to always tell the truth. In Christian Science, truth is a synonym for God, so it's always important to be honest, to be a person of substance and of integrity. The last commandment, to not covet, it means again to have one's eyes open to seeing the good that one has without thinking that another has something that unfortunately we just don't have. I mentioned that the Ten Commandments have been very important in the evolution of humanity. And I think that one of the reasons for that is that, in a sense, the Ten Commandments define identity. You see, for example, The daughter of God has no limited self-image, has no limited sense of her own capacities, but the daughter of God sees that she can do whatever God would have her do for the glory of God. Or the Son of God has no interest in stealing because he understands that he has all good from God. The little boy who's 7 years old, I'm persuaded, wants to tell the truth because it's just simply his nature to be honest. The Ten Commandments never judge us. The Ten Commandments never condemn us. The Ten Commandments are always supporting us in our showing forth our true spiritual nature as reflections of this infinite love. I mentioned that we always have what we need as reflections of this divine love. That was the experience of a friend of mine who, with his family, made a cross-country move in order to accept a job. Everything was going well, except after 2 or 3 years, there were organizational changes and he didn't have a job anymore. What he did have was he had a wife, 2 small children, and a mortgage. The situation was serious. Perhaps his situation is a little bit like the situation for many people in the London area or in another part of the UK or in other parts of the world where honestly, he didn't honestly know how things were going to be working out financially for him and for his family. He prayed, but he didn't start his prayers with what he didn't have. He started his prayers with what he did have and what he knew and with what he understood. He thought about just how much God loves him, loves his wife, loves his 2 precious children. And he began just to have a great sense of peace. In fact, the idea occurred to him that it would actually be impossible for God to not meet their needs because of how much God loved them. He had a great sense of peace and a great sense of expectation. He knew things would work out, even though he didn't know exactly how. Not long after that, he was offered a job. This job was going to require that he learn new skills, that he developed new capacities, but he was confident that with God, he could do the work. Now, some 6 years or so later, he's done very well at the job. The organization has been blessed. His family has been greatly blessed by that job. The whole experience confirmed for him that God is always there for him and for his family, that the love of God is always there for every person and for every family, the world over. You might ask yourself, does Christian Science always heal? That's a good question. Mary Baker Eddy discovered Christian Science in 1866. Since then, those turning to God for healing in this way have faced essentially the same health problems as the rest of humanity. Sometimes they've been healed immediately, sometimes they haven't. But the overall record of Christian Science healing is a very strong record indeed. Mary Baker Eddy went on to found the Church of Christ Scientist that has branches in many countries around the world. She served as the pastor of the church, later as the pastor emeritus. She also founded a series of magazines, the Christian Science Sentinel, which is published weekly, the Christian Science Journal, which is a monthly magazine, and the Herald of Christian Science, also a monthly magazine. In each and every issue of these magazines, since well more than a century now, have been published, as I say, in each and every issue, verified testimonies of healings of everything from blindness to cancers to AIDS, healings of eating disorders, healings of Alzheimer's, healings of broken bones and of addictions. Up until now, there have been some 65,000 such healings published. When you read these healings, it feels a little bit like reading the healings that were affected by Jesus and his disciples when you read the Gospels, feels a little bit like reading the Gospels. Also, in Christian Science churches around the world, there are Wednesday testimony meetings, and at those meetings, people tell about how they've applied the teachings of Christian Science to find healing. A lot of times, human thought is on that ground floor level or on the first story level, but healing always happens to the degree we realize our spiritual nature, to the degree we demonstrate our true spiritual nature. And of course, the joy, the privilege, and sometimes the hard work of demonstrating that true spiritual nature is the great privilege of following the perfect example of Jesus, the perfect example of the Master. Up until now, all of the examples that I've given have been of individuals and of their families, but I wanted to give an example of how to pray for the collectivity. So this can be for your city, this can be for your country, or this can be for a major international problem, such as overcoming racism, for example. This was the experience of a friend of mine in a developing country. He accepted the job as the financial controller of a large government institution that employed more than 1,400 people. But 2 or 3 months into the job, he came to realize that employee theft was an enormous problem. That employee theft took a number of forms. First, people were manipulating the computer system with the complicity of the cashiers in order to rob the organization. There was the issuing of false receipts. There was even the outright theft of materials from the premises. My friend wanted the organization to truly be serving its clients. He wanted it to be operating consistently with national and international standards of accounting. He wanted it to be transparent. He took a number of steps. First of all, he modernized the accounting system. He set up a sort of internal auditing system. He improved the inventory system, and he began to work to increase employee salaries. But most especially, he prayed. He prayed that his eyes would be opened to see the honesty and the integrity of each and every one of those 1,400 employees, because each and every one of those 1,400 employees was and is the perfect reflection of this perfect infinite love. My friend's efforts to reform the organization were met with stiff resistance. That resistance took several forms. One of the forms that it took was there was a group of employees who wrote a false report about my friend and then sent that report to his immediate superior and to the Minister of Finance in his country. All of the allegations were investigated. None of them were true, and that was recognized. My friend kept on praying. And then a friend of his, who was a colleague, said that he had inadvertently overheard a conversation between 2 other employees. And these 2 other employees had said that really the only way to stop these reforms was going to be by eliminating my friend using witchcraft. I should say that in some countries, in some cultures around the world, witchcraft is a way of seeking to control the other person. But I'm not sure about in the UK, but in Canada, we have our own ways of seeking to do that in a job context, in a job situation. That can be backbiting, that can be a campaign of lies, that can be backstabbing. Sometimes office politics can simply be brutal. But in that culture, it was witchcraft. My friend heard this, but he was unimpressed. He understood that in truth, there is only infinite love and its expression. Not long after that, he was alone in the office one Saturday working, and he felt a very sharp pain, and a part of his body seemed immobilized. He recognized right away that this was impersonal resistance to these reforms that were going to bless everybody. He prayed. Specifically, he prayed with this passage from Science and Health. Your influence for good depends upon the weight you throw into the right scale. The good you do and embody gives you the only power obtainable. He knew he was embodying good. He knew that his motivation was simply to see everybody blessed in that organization. It took him a couple of days of steadfast prayer, but finally the pain stopped altogether and he was able to move freely. He kept on praying. By this time, senior management had assigned a couple of security guards to protect him at work because he had received very direct threats. But he was unfazed. He knew there's nothing apart from infinite love in its expression. And then a wonderful thing happened. His colleagues at the same level as him within the organization, instead of just saying, oh yes, if you want to do those reforms, you go ahead, they really got behind the reforms and supported them. And not long after that, everybody, all of the employees were supporting the reforms. My friend knew that it was so. He could see it in the internal audits. He could see it in the books. It was a great victory for my friend. It was a great victory for that institution in a country where corruption has often been a major problem. I wanted to recount that experience so that you would have confidence. If you're praying for your neighborhood, if you're praying for local government, if you're praying for the safety of people and that there be, for example, fewer knife attacks in the UK. I don't think my friend ever once had the thought, oh, I'm just one person, how can my prayers? He was confident that the power to bring about change was not in his own, some personal power of his. It was within the very nature of reality itself that he was recognizing the power of this infinite love. He was living consistently with this love. I wanted to read one last passage to you from Science and Health. This is a deep passage about identity that is read towards the end of every Christian Science Sunday service. And it's actually the very last thing that's read at Christian Science Sunday school sessions. In it, the author uses the term man to mean men and women in their true spiritual nature. Here's the passage. There is no life, truth, intelligence, nor substance in matter. All is infinite mind and its infinite manifestation, for God is all in all. Spirit is immortal truth. Matter is mortal error. Spirit is the real and eternal. Matter is the unreal and temporal. Spirit is God, and man is his image and likeness. Therefore, man is not material. He is spiritual. Let me summarize. I gave you a bit of background information on Mary Baker Eddy, how she discovered in the scriptures a sense of God as being infinite, unopposed love, how she discovered in the scriptures a sense of identity as being the very expression of this love, how this reality of who God is, this reality of who we are, comes to each of us wherever we are to encourage us, to strengthen us, to comfort us. It comes to heal us. This reality of all things comes to redeem us and to redeem all humanity. I wanted you to have a sense of confidence. Again, if you're praying for yourself and for your own safety, if you're praying for things in the community, such as the safety of women, for example, if you're praying for greater integrity, greater honesty in elected officials, and of course, our prayers are effective to the degree we live consistent with those prayers. So, for example, if we're praying for greater honesty amongst elected officials, to the degree we live that honesty and that integrity, our prayers in that direction are going to be effective. Just like it's money that we would have in our bank account that means that our check is accepted as valid. That's what gives authority to that check. What gives authority to our prayers is the way that we live our lives day in and day out, the degree to which we follow the perfect example of Jesus. I wanted to heartily recommend an in-depth study of the Bible as a way of seeing even more clearly your true spiritual nature, I wanted to heartily recommend an in-depth study of science and health with Key to the Scriptures as a way of understanding the Bible in its practical, in its spiritual significance. I wanted to again thank First Church of Christ Scientist in Woking, England for sponsoring this talk. The talk is going to be available on the website www.truththatmeetsyourneed.com, www.truththatmeetsyourneed.com, so you can watch the talk again, or you can recommend it to friends or to family. And lastly, I wanted to thank each of you for your participation and for your kind attention. Thank you and goodbye.